just want to remind you that actually we are having the three small sessions, while in the other group, 3 small sessions on Zoom are taking place. And after that, we will all gather here to have the plenary with Dr. Ricke. So this is the plan. So the first speaker is Dr. Joyce McPherson, who teaches English at the University of Tennessee of Chattanooga. She is the creator of online programs Homeschool Tools and Shakespeare Tools, as well as the author of a series of biographies for children for Greenleaf Press, including Beyond the Land of Narnia, the story of C.S. Lewis. She is currently writing a children's biography on George MacDonald. She has published in the Victorian Institute Journal and the English Journal, and has contributed chapters to books on Victorian fiction and containing childhood, as well as presented for the International Conference of the Children's Literature Association. So she is the author of 33 volumes for children. Thank you for being here. Please.
Well, thank you. And I don't know if we have a PowerPoint. We do, yes? Oh, magic. Okay, thank you. All right. And to advance, I just push here? Is this right? Okay. Well, greetings from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and my students who are busy writing independently while I meet with you. It is a delight to be here. I find that these kinds of conferences are like peeling back the literary veil to see the deeper magic, and I'm delighted to share this time with you. C.S. Lewis wrote in Mere Christianity, "For me, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning." His legacy of reaching the heart through stories was inspired by the works of George MacDonald. When Lewis created an anthology of his favorite quotes from MacDonald, he wrote in his introduction, "I have never concealed the fact that I regarded him as my master. Indeed, I fancy that I have never written a book in which I did not quote from him." Both authors used fairy tales for children to inspire their readers to see a deeper reality. George MacDonald, in his essay entitled Imagination, Its Function and Culture, exhorted us to seek not that your sons and daughters should not see visions, should not dream dreams. Seek that they should see true visions, that they should dream noble dreams. Lewis and MacDonald developed the idea that noble dreams led the heart to understand truth. In their stories, they illustrated how true nobility comes from invisible qualities of character, and the truly royal belong to a kingdom that is beyond physical sight. For both authors, fairy tales were a medium to take the reader beyond the rational mind. As MacDonald reminded us through the words of the great-great-grandmother, Irene, in The Princess and the Goblin, seeing is not believing, it is only seeing. I will examine how Lewis was shaped by MacDonald's literature and how he transmitted through his own work the reality of enchantment that is open to all the king's noble sons and daughters. From the first introduction of the child princess Irene in the unabridged version of The Princess and the Goblin, MacDonald provides hints that nobility is not a matter of birth, but of character. The story begins, "There was once a little princess who..." "But Mr. Author, why do you always write about princesses?" "Because every little girl is a princess." "You will make them vain if you tell them that." "Not if they understand what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" "What do you mean by a princess?" "The daughter of a king." "Very well, then every little girl is a princess, and there would be no need to say anything about it, except that she is always in danger of forgetting her rank and behaving as if she had grown out of the mud." MacDonald illustrates in his stories that royalty is the potential of everyone, and it relies on inner qualities rather than external titles. This concept is reinforced in The Princess and the Goblin when Curdy's mother says of Princess Irene, "She's a good girl, I am certain, and that's more than being a princess." Or when Mr. Author says, "But Ludi the nurse had very foolish notions concerning the dignity of a princess, not understanding that the truest princess is just the one who loves all her brothers and sisters best and is most able to do them good by being humble toward them." In fact, the true royalty works backwards, from nobility of thought to nobility of position. Thus, Irene may be recognized as a princess from the outset, but the real proof is how she interacts with others like her nurse and the miner boy, Curdy. The same holds for Curdy. He confesses when he does wrong, and MacDonald observes, "Here I should like to remark, for the sake of princess and princesses in general, that it is a low and contemptible thing to refuse to confess a fault, or even an error. If a true princess has done wrong, she is always uneasy until she has had an opportunity of throwing the wrongness away from her by saying, 'I did it, and I wish I had not, and I'm sorry for having done it.' So you see, there is some ground for supposing that Curdy was not a miner only, but a prince as well. If, as MacDonald claims, every child is the daughter or son of a king, then there must be more to nobility than heredity from one of the few monarchs on the earth. MacDonald, who studied for the ministry and read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew, hearkens to an older royalty of Adam and Eve, who were given dominion by the Lord of creation, thus making all their descendants royal. Lewis echoes this idea when Aslan tells Prince Caspian, "You come of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve, and that is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar, and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth." Amen. The shame comes because every person not only has potential for royalty, but also for degradation. In the sequel, The Princess and Curdy, the young miner is given the gift of perceiving the true inner person by simply touching the hand. The great-great-grandmother explains, "A beast does not know that he is a beast, and the nearer a man gets to being a beast, the less he knows it." C.S. Lewis chose this sentence for his anthology of MacDonald quotes. For both authors, a person could grow less noble until they were essentially beasts. In Narnia, Lewis describes the degradation of talking animals that lose the powers of speech, as in The Lapsed Bear of Stormness and The Final Judgment on Ginger the Cat. These stories were a warning to those pursuing the noble path. Indeed, the process of growing into nobility is costly. MacDonald's story of the wise woman illustrates how growth in character is painful. In this tale, there is a spoiled princess who, as she grew worse, she grew worse, for she never tried to grow better. Her papa called for the wise woman to help, and MacDonald wrote, "How very badly you have treated her," the wise woman said. "Poor child." "Treated her badly?" gasped the king. "Haven't we given her every mortal thing she wanted?" "Surely," said the wise woman, "what else could have all but killed her? You should have given her more of a few things of the other sort. The wise woman takes the princess away so that she can experience hardship until she learns to be a true princess in her heart, one who is kind to others and seeks to serve them. At first, the princess reviles the wise woman and will not accept her help. Through improving experiences, she begins to grow in the right direction and follows the wise woman, who gives her a series of trials. Only after failing miserably does she ask for help. The final trial is still difficult, but the wise woman helps her to see in a new way that enables her to choose the right action. The Wise Woman was first published with the title The Lost Princess, a double story, because at the same time that the spoiled princess was growing better, another little girl was inserted into the castle and grew worse. She was not able to become a true princess during that tale. But, as MacDonald pointed out, the story was not over yet. Lewis incorporates the painful process of growing into nobility in the Chronicles of Narnia. Edmund learns that repentance comes before kingship, and redemption comes at an incredible price. Prince Caspian learns that a true prince must be brave and keep the faith. Eustace learns that he must die to his inner dragon, and only Aslan can undragon him. For MacDonald and Lewis, nobility comes through the suffering of growth. One of the most interesting growth lessons takes place in Prince Caspian, when Lucy must lead the rest of the party by following Aslan, even though no one else can see him. She is Queen of Narnia, yet the other royals hesitate to believe her. Lewis is spinning a tale with a similar message to MacDonald's story of Princess Irene, whom Curdie does not believe at first. The great-great-grandmother tells her, "You must be content not to be believed for a while. It is very hard to bear, but I have had to bear it and shall have to bear it many a time yet." Why do these noble children face this particular challenge? In both stories, they are putting their faith in an invisible ruler, a parallel to the Christian concept of faith in the unseen creator. Both authors believed that fairy tales and fiction held deeper meanings. Fantasy was not a temporary escape, but a lasting journey toward the king and his kingdom. As MacDonald wrote in The Elect Lady, "The Lord of the Promise is the Lord of all true parables and all good fairy tales." Lewis adopted this precept and, like MacDonald, used his stories to point to a higher reality which required a nobility of faith. A significant aspect of growing in the nobility of faith is the wisdom of obedience. In the Silver Chair, Aslan gives Jill signs to remember, with the warning that the signs which you have learned here will not look at all as you expect them to look when you meet them there. That is why it is so important to know them by heart and pay no attention to appearances. However, Jill and Eustace grow careless of the signs and must learn that noble persons remember and obey. Their story illustrates the importance of bearing love and allegiance to the king by following his ways. In The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis described objective values that inform the conscience. He cited these values as another artifact of the reality of God, because we perceive a type of eternal law outside of ourselves. Each person has an inner truth that convicts of right and wrong, and even when things look different, the conscience is the guide to virtue. MacDonald's Princess Irene knows that a princess must do as she promises and reminds her father of this principle, and he replies, "Indeed she must, my child, except it be wrong." Even in keeping promises, the conscience should be acting to evaluate whether an action is right or wrong, and true nobility recognizes that it is under the eternal law and follows it. In The Horse and His Boy, C.S. Lewis gives King Loon the opportunity to speak into what it means to be a nobleman. When his son questions whether it is right for him to become king after his father, the king replies, "The king's under the law, for it's the law makes him a king. Hast no more power to start away from thy crown than any sentry from his post." Moreover, King Loon explains, "For this is what it means to be a king, to be first in every desperate attack and last in every desperate retreat. And when there's hunger in the land, as must be now and then in bad years, to wear finer clothes and laugh louder over a scantier meal than any man in your land." Royalty follows the eternal law and leads through service and risk, obeying with wisdom even when signs do not look at all as expected. For both authors, this is not simple moralism, but an actual dying to self to become noble. And this process is aided by the imagination. In MacDonald's quote about noble dreams, he continues, "Such outgoing of the imagination is one with aspiration, and will do more to elevate above what is low and vile than all possible inculcations of morality." The aspiration is toward God and holiness. MacDonald's lost princess has to ask the wise woman for help, and Aslan likes to be asked, as Fledge reminds the children. The challenges that are necessary for becoming noble are intimately associated with the nearness of God or his representative through the suffering. So the great-great-grandmother in MacDonald's story weeps with Curdie as he suffers in the purifying rose fire. In the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan dies on the stone table to redeem Edmund. He also walks with sighs beside Shasta and reveals that he was the one who guided the boy's boat when he was cast out as an infant. Indeed, seeking righteousness may take one on a pathway to God that leads through death. In the last battle, Runwit the centaur says, "Remember that all worlds draw to an end, and that noble death is a treasure which no one is too poor to buy." MacDonald interpreted nobility as dying to self throughout his realistic fiction as well. Even for characters that were of noble birth, their sacrificial service was a truer indicator than their birth certificate. C.S. Lewis's favorite realistic novel by MacDonald was What's Mine's Mine, in which two brothers, one of whom is the hereditary clan chief, care for their people despite the demise of the clan system in the face of the Highland clearances. In Guild Court, MacDonald wrote, "A man must do his duty, whether he likes it or not, and whether it is appreciated or not. But if he can regard this duty as the will of God, a work not fallen upon him by chance, but given him to do, understanding that everything well done belongs to his kingdom, and everything badly done to the kingdom of darkness, surely even the irksomeness of his work will no longer be insuperable." Here we have the key to understanding the true motive for these characters. They have an allegiance to a higher kingdom. For MacDonald and Lewis, the allegiance to a higher kingdom meant service for others, often leading to social justice. In The Princess and Curdie, yes, okay, 1 minute, 2, okay. Yes, in The Princess and Curdie and in Prince Caspian, it is the true princes and princesses who stand up for righteousness and save the kingdom. Curdie must battle a populace that is degraded to the point that the king is powerless and injustice rules. Prince Caspian must battle a usurping tyrant who has oppressed the old Narnians. MacDonald and Lewis believed that people are connected to the kingdom. In large and small ways, actions matter. In fact, social justice not only requires saving others, but reminding them of who they are. MacDonald wrote, "I have seen little princesses behave like the children of thieves and lying beggars, and that is why they need to be told that they are princesses. And that is why, when I tell a story of this kind, I like to tell it about a princess." Thank you very much. Perfect. No, someone will stand there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Joyce, Dr. McPherson. And I would introduce our next speaker, who is from France. Dr. Anne-Frédérique Mochel-Caballero is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Picardie, Jules Verne in Amiens, France, and a member of the Corpus research team. She currently teaches a class on fantasy literature and a class on the Bible and its influence on English literature. Her PhD, published in 2011, explores gender's relations in works of C.S. Lewis. Her research focuses on fantasy literature, gender issues, and the interface between literature and theology. She has published articles on authors including C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald, Madeleine L'Engle, and Rowling. I just want to add that Anne came 2 years ago to our conference when nobody else came. I mean, very, very few, because it was pandemic. And it was an amazing thing, because she is the only French C.S. Lewis scholar that we know about. And she really believed that she's alone on the planet with us. She was about to quit. But she, in a miraculous, fantastic way, we got connected, and she came, and this is an amazing thing, because she got to be connected now with scholars from all over the world, and we really appreciate that actually she is teaching fantasy, and she is doing a great job. And she's with us again.
Thank you. Can I have the PowerPoint? Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say that I'm amazed at the number of links there are between your talk and mine. You'll see, we haven't talked, so we haven't discussed this beforehand, but you'll see there are several links between what we're saying. Yeah, right. So years ago, when I was writing my doctoral thesis on C.S. Lewis and gender, I came across an anecdote narrated by Don W. King, which I would like to tell you about now. One day he was researching Lewis at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, and a colleague said to him, "Oh, we don't care much for Lewis. He was such a bully with most people, and his ideas about women were positively medieval." So I would like to reflect on this expression for a moment, positively medieval. Of course, the woman meant both words in a derogatory way, positively as in very, extremely, and medieval as in very old, irrelevant for our present time. Two reactions come to my mind. First, ironically, the adverb positively comes from the adjective positive, which can also mean admirable, beneficial. Secondly, should medieval necessarily be understood negatively? Is what is old always out of date? As we all know, Lewis would have answered in the negative. Yet it's quite funny to read, and surprised by joy, that Lewis himself used this term medieval as an insult, referring to the supernatural, at a time when he was still an atheist. But after a period of what he called chronological snobbery, Lewis came to think that there was great wisdom to be found in old books. So in this paper, I would like to concentrate on one essay in particular, which is called The Necessity of Chivalry, in which Lewis presents an ideal dating back to the Middle Ages in very laudatory terms. In this essay, Lewis mentions Lancelot, So the greatest of all the imaginary knights in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, and he refers to him as being the meekest man that ever ate in hall among ladies, and the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest. This combination of meekness and fierceness is seen by Lewis as a paradox, but one that is absolutely essential to the world. What, you may ask, is the relevance of this ideal to the modern world? It is terribly relevant. It may or may not be practicable. The Middle Ages notoriously failed to obey it, but it is certainly practical. Practical as the fact that men in a desert must find water or die. Lewis cites ancient heroes such as Achilles or Attila, whose conduct was characterized by extreme cruelty. For them, there was no question of combining bravery and mercy. Natural heroism is well outside the chivalric tradition, and that's why it has to be taught. The medieval ideal brought together two things which have no natural tendency to gravitate towards one another. It brought them together for that very reason. It taught humility and forbearance to the great warrior because everyone knew by experience how much he usually needed that lesson. It demanded valor of the urbane and modest man because everyone knew that he was as likely as not to be a milksop. According to Lewis, producing human beings who combine the two aspects of Lancelot's character is a condition of happiness and dignity for a society. It's not a work of nature, but a work of art. Lewis denounces the liberal and enlightened attitude, two terms he uses in a negative way, of rejecting the combative side of man as an atavistic evil. He also condemns the attitude of those at the other extreme who plead for a return to a pre-Christian ferocity, like that of Achilles, in the name of rejecting weak sentimentality. Lewis discards the false alternative between brutality and softness. Embracing the chivalric ideal is, in his eyes, the only way to be neither a bloodthirsty wolf nor a defenseless sheep. The ideal embodied in Lancelot is escapism, in a sense never dreamed of by those who use that word. It offers the only possible escape from a world divided between wolves who do not understand and sheep who cannot defend the things which make life desirable. This ideal can be found throughout Lewis's works, and especially his fiction, including the Ransom trilogy, the Chronicles of Narnia, and Till We Have Faces. In these books, we find characters who lack one of the two necessary components, as well as knights in the making. Lewis presents the paradox of the ideal knight as being medieval. However, it is also an ideal which is actually at the heart of Christianity, in that it can be used to describe Jesus Christ himself. So it's no surprise that Aslan, the Christ-like ruler of Narnia, should be depicted as the perfect ideal knight. So my first part is called Wolves and Sheep. So Jacques Sis, who was the first person ever to write a doctoral thesis on C.S. Lewis in France, once told me that Lewis always wrote the same book. So by this he did not mean that Lewis's work was repetitive, but rather that the main themes that interested him could be found under different forms in all his works. This is certainly true of the concept of the ideal knight. In Lewis's fiction, there are wolves, there are sheep, and there are ideal knights, or at least characters who tend towards this ideal. Let me just give you a few examples. So on the side of the wolves, there are Western Divine and the members of the Knights in the Ransom trilogy. Rabadash, who is characterized by pride and anger in The Horse and His Boy. The White Witch, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And Orl's abusive father, the brutal king of Glome, in Till We Have Faces. All these characters lack humility and forbearance. They're ruthless, and they want to conquer the world and beyond without taking anyone or anything outside their own ambitions into consideration. On the side of the sheep, there is La Saraline, Aravis's compromising friend who values luxury over freedom in The Horse and His Boy. Susan, who is held hostage to her fears throughout the Chronicles of Narnia. Aurel's sister, Redival, who feels lonely and insecure, and as a consequence, her main concern seems to be to find a husband and to have faces. In The Allegory of Love, Lewis comments on Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside and states that what leads to Cresside's downfall is the fact that her ruling passion is fear. This causes her to always seek the protection of a strong man and eventually to betray her lover. Cresside may have inspired Lewis to create characters like La Saraline, Susan, and Redival, who are, to various degrees, in Lewis's own words, milksops. In contrast to these characters who are either cruel or cowardly, there are ideal knights in the making. A lot of them actually start by tending towards one extreme or the other and have to learn to become ideal knights through an initiatory journey. That's my second part. As Nancy Lou Patterson has shown beautifully in Ransoming the Wasteland, in that hideous strength, Mark and Jane Staddock have polar problems and go through redeeming journeys which echo and oppose each other. Mark must learn cupiditas and retreat from Belbury, the center of death. Jane must, in contrast, accept the invitation offered her and go to St. Anne's, the center of life, there to learn caritas. Mark and Jane both have serious weaknesses of character that must be corrected. At the beginning of the novel, Mark Staddock is a coward. He's too consensual, and as his name indicates, he has to become more martial, to oppose evil and to fight the nice. While Jane, the independent, has to become more welcoming, to relinquish selfishness, to let go of her fear of being taken in by joining Ransom's community. There is a similar crossing of narrative arcs in The Horse and His Boy, where Shasta needs to gain in fierceness and Aravis in meekness. The humble Shasta has to learn self-reliance and leadership, to become more courageous, not to feel sorry for himself, and eventually to take part in a real battle. Meanwhile, the princess Aravis needs to learn the opposite qualities of humility and respect for all levels and forms of life. She must learn not to despise people and she deems inferior, and to feel empathy for her slave who has been punished because of her. In George MacDonald's fiction, which Lewis read and loved, there is a tale which may have inspired Lewis on this topic. In Photogen and Nycteris, the two eponymous protagonists have been raised by a witch who has turned them into beings of the day and night. It's also sometimes called the day boy and the night girl. The witch exacerbates aggressiveness in the boy and fragility in the girl. In the course of the story, they learn from each other until in the end they come to love what they feared and rejected. In another tale, The Light Princess, the young heroine starts as hard and unfeeling and discovers in Finding Gravity the sweetness of compassion. In the third volume of the Ransom trilogy, Ransom has become a near-perfect Christ-like figure. To get to this point, he has experienced the rediscovery of both fierceness and meekness. It's no coincidence that his initiatory journeys take place on Mars and Venus. He first learns the art of combat during the fight against the Nakra, which offers him the opportunity to restore his compromised sense of courage and exercise the martial virtues required for the impending struggle on Earth. Then, on his next journey, he primarily learns the art of abandonment when he is breastfed by the planet Venus herself. The mouse, Rippy Cheap, behaves like a medieval knight in Narnia, full of forlorn hopes, death or glory charges, and last stands. He's always the first to volunteer to challenge the enemy or to fight to save his own or another's honor. In Prince Caspian, Aslan deplores that he thinks a little bit too much about his honor. But in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the mouse has learned to mend his ways. Indeed, although Eustace tries to humiliate him several times, Whippy-Cheep shows him great kindness on the day of his misfortune by keeping him company once he has become a dragon. Whippy-Cheep is indeed formidable on the battlefield and gentle in society. In Till We Have Faces, Bardia, the soldier, is the antithesis of the King of Gloam, who represents senseless violence, in that he is both kind and strong. As Thomas Howard comments, his whole life has been the straightforward matter of obedience to custom and rule and decency, obedience to his sovereign, love and faithfulness to his wife, bravery in battle, hard work in his daily tasks. He is a sturdy soldier who, nevertheless, is very tender, and tears come to his eyes when he is faced with Auror's distress. Lewis praises Lancelot's ability to shed tears in The Necessity of Chivalry. Likewise, in English literature in the 16th century, Lewis explains that there was no inhibition about tears in ancient and medieval literature and life, and that tears only became something to apologize about during the Renaissance. In Lewis's time, boys were told that they should never cry. And in the line The Witch and the Wardrobe, Lewis, the narrator, draws a clear contrast between what his young readers may have been taught and what happens in the fantasy world of Narnia. Then, after a bit, Susan came down the tree. She and Peter felt pretty shaky when they met, and I won't say there wasn't kissing and crying on both sides. But in Narnia, no one thinks any the worse of you for that. In Planet Narnia, Michael Ward famously argues that each of the 7 Narnia books correspond to a planet. He views Prince Caspian as being under the influence of Mars, the god of war, and shows how the different characters have to develop martial behavior, but one in which knightliness is evident as much in gentleness as in hardness. So Peter has to fight in single combat against Miraz, but he must also refrain from stabbing his opponent while he is down. Ward also mentions Lucy, whose story is the most developed, and who receives the martial spirit while she is in the clearing with Aslan. She buries her head in his mane and can feel some lion strength going into her. Then Aslan calls her a lioness, and she's ready for the difficult task of waking up her siblings to carry on with their journey. Lucy is arguably one of Lewis's favorite characters, and she shows great courage in the face of danger, for example, when she agrees to enter the magician's house in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Once queen, she is known as Lucy the Valiant, and she rides to battle in The Horse and His Boy. Yet she's also kind to others and secretly shares her water ration with Eustace when he complains of thirst in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. In the last battle, she sheds tears for the rebellious dwarves, begging the lion to intervene on their behalf so that they can enjoy the surrounding delights in Aslan's country. All these characters have a relatively similar trajectory. While none of them are perfect, over the course of the stories, they develop qualities that bring them closer to the model of the ideal knight. So that's my third part. The perfect ideal knight. There is one character in the Chronicles of Narnia who represents the perfect ideal knight, Aslan, the lion, the king of animals, the archetype of power, might, and strength. His fearsome roar and his muscular power are repeatedly mentioned, and when the children first see him in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they are struck with awe. And they are struck by the fact that he's terrible, good and terrible at the same time. But this fearsome feline can also behave in a very gentle way. For example, when he bathes and dresses Eustace like a mother caring for her baby in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, or when he very progressively reveals himself to a frightened and disconsolate Shasta in The Horse and His Boy. Aslan can also change his form, and at one point he appears in the form of a lamb. This is a clear biblical reference, as Jesus is described as both the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the Lamb, as it were, slain in the book of Revelation. The Christ-like lion, Aslan, is both benevolent and formidable. As Marie-Catherine Cailava remarks, the fact that Jesus is a lion in Narnia corresponds to the image of Jesus that people had in the Middle Ages. Their vision of Jesus was not that of an ethereal being, and here is a representation that I found on the internet, as it would be represented in later art, but that of a manly, solid man with piercing eyes, square jaw, and a posture that spoke of physical might and great will. Aslan resembles Jesus as he is presented in the Gospels, sometimes wielding a whip to chase away the merchants from the temple, sometimes kissing little children whom he has taken into his arms. Although Lewis never mentions Jesus in this essay, he clearly considers him the most perfect example of the ideal knight. In a letter written some 20 years later, Lewis derides people who refer to gentle Jesus and states that the most striking thing about our Lord is the union of great ferocity with extreme tenderness. Already in 1946, in his preface to the anthology of MacDonald's unspoken sermons, Lewis made it clear that he was influenced both by George MacDonald and by the Bible on this topic. I know hardly any other writer who seems to be closer or more continually close to the Spirit of Christ himself. Hence his Christ-like union of tenderness and severity. Nowhere else outside the New Testament have I found terror and comfort so intertwined. The concept of the ideal knight is very present in Lewis's works. One of the reasons for this might be that it is rooted in several systems of thought of which he had a high opinion. As Colin Duriez notes, in the Chronicles, Lewis draws very much on a medieval articulation of the values of courtesy, gentleness, and honor, in which insights of the virtuous pagans of antiquity are seen as being completed by the teaching, life, and heroic sacrifice of Christ, the dying God. In the paradox of the ideal knight, Lewis is able to combine his love for antiquity, for the Middle Ages, and for the Bible. Lewis theoretically conceived the notion of the ideal knight in 1940 when he wrote The Necessity of Chivalry. But the ideas present behind this notion can be found before and after that date, not only in his fiction, but in all his other works too. He revels in paradoxes and offers the reader a variety of dichotomies which are inspired by it, such as reason versus imagination, north versus south, asceticism versus indulgence, to quote but a few. In the fourth chapter of The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, Jason Baxter deals with Lewis's rejection of modern education that divorces the heart and the mind, as it is described in The Abolition of Man. Baxter claims that for Lewis it was urgent to teach chivalry again because it was the very endeavor to hold the parts of the human being in tension to render a young man, in this case, an ethically whole person. That is, to unite those parts of a human being that do not naturally sit well with one another, extreme courage and gentle civility. Today, 60 years after Lewis's death, this ideal is still one that needs to be taught. As Monica Hilder remarks, the radical message of heroic meekness that Jesus preached and that Lewis endorsed is so revolutionary it is hardly better understood today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I am very happy to introduce the next speaker, who is a friend of mine. We have been growing together for more than 25 years. I think, of course, I'm a bit faster in getting older than she. Raluca Ștefania Pelin is an assistant lecturer at the University of Life Sciences from Iași, where she teaches English for specific purposes. The main focus of her research is the integration of concepts related to emotional intelligence and emotional literacy skills into the study of literary and not-literary texts. And if you are interested to see the articles that she has published on this theme, you can read in the book, and we are happy to receive her, to listen to her, and I'm trying my best to convince her that she belongs here. Absolutely, she is the perfect fit in this panel.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. Actually, I expected a smaller room like the one in the morning. When I saw this room, I was discussing about the placing here, which is strange. And I feel like I went through the door of Narnia, and I feel like in Narnia I'm trying to put my feet, so to say. The topic I'm going to talk to you today is C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, the misunderstood dynamics between the self and the other. So if there's this one? Okay, if there is a great divorce, there must have been a great marriage, but whose marriage? And could there have been such a thing as a marriage of heaven and hell? C.S. Lewis hints at right at the beginning of the preface of his book. Well, there must have been the case when hell did not exist, even as a concept, and heaven was paradise. It was man as I being in perfect relationship and communication with the eternal thou. The great split occurred when man decided to use freedom and to choose and doubt. As a consequence, man is continuously challenged with the demand, the chance, and the responsibility to make choices. Freedom can only have meaning and be meaningful if it is in relation to responsibility. Otherwise, it will degenerate into arbitrariness, as Viktor Frankl remarked. Lewis himself says in the preface that we are always faced with the either-or. If we accept heaven, we shall not be able to retain even the smallest and the small intimate souvenirs of hell. The greatest task of man, after the painful fall and the start of this process, is the process of divorce is to restore relationship and communication as much as possible, within the limits set by a well-understood responsible freedom. Therefore, the greatest commandments and imperatives, love your neighbor as yourself, Mark 12:31, and do to others as you would have them do to you, Luke 3:31, are the rightful path towards reconciliation and redemption. The focus of this presentation will be on the reception of Lewis's book from the perspective of emotional intelligence, Paul Ricoeur's Oneself as Another, and Martin Buber's I and Thou, and also resorting to concepts from Viktor Frankl's logotherapy as key to man's search for meaning. Starting from the two great commandments that bring together man and as an I and man as another, one can infer that the fullness of being I can only be achieved by knowing the other, by having the right feelings for and acting toward the good of the other. The golden rule can only be fulfilled in mutual action when the I realizes that what he does to others may be done unto him. Paul Ricoeur gets to the core of this when he asserts that the golden rule and the imperative of the respect owed to persons do not simply have the same field of exercise, they also have the same aim, to establish reciprocity wherever there is a lack of it. Ricoeur, from Ricoeur. In Love Your Neighbor as Yourself, the essence of what the I-thou relation means gains a profound meaning if considered from the perspective of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. No one can become fully aware of the very essence of another human being unless he loves him. By his love, he is enabled to see the essential traits and features in the beloved person. And even more, he sees that which is potential in him, which is not yet actualized, but yet ought to be actualized. Furthermore, by this love, the loving person enables the beloved person to actualize these potentialities. By making him aware of what he can be and what he should become, he makes these potentialities come true. The pillars that may hold this perfect construct of the I-thou relation are represented by the understanding of the entities involved in the relation. As persons, not as individual or a mass, the accurate perception of the roles of each person and of the way in which language is used to support this construct.
First, Martin Buber's work, I and Thou, sheds light on the way people relate to others. The I of the person can know the other, the thou, only in relation and only with reference to the present time. This kind of relation is presented in parallel with the experience between the I and it, in which it represents the objects that man contemplates, experiences, and uses, and can extract knowledge from. Paradoxically, mortals can become it and replace thou. There is no relation between I and it. The world of it is set in the context of space and time, hence events are perceived as it. Comparatively, the world of thou is not set in the context of space and time, as it transcends them and is stored into being in the spiritual realm. Even though without it man cannot live, the man who lives with it alone, says Buber, is not a man. There is, however, a thou that can never become an it, and who is the eternal thou. Every particular thou is a glimpse through to the eternal thou. By means of every particular thou, the primary word addresses the eternal thou. Thus, to the twofold grasp of the emotional intelligence competences, awareness of self and awareness of others, a third dimension should be added, that of the awareness of God, the only thou whose being is immutable and in relation to whom man can make sense of his being and of that of the other. If God is the ratio essendi of myself, he thereby becomes the ratio conoscendi of myself. And the idea of God is in me as the very mark of the author upon his work, a mark that assures the resemblance between us. Recur. Since I and thou are in the image of the perfect thou, both selves should strive to come into unity that reflects the perfection of the creating thou. Thus, idem, sameness, and ipso, selfhood, merge into a perfect symbiosis, as Ricke finally renders it. Selfhood of oneself implies otherness to such an intimate degree that one cannot be thought without the other, that instead one passes into the other. What Viktor Frankl's named the self-transcendence of human existence denotes the fact that human beings being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself, be it a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter. The more one forgets himself by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human he is, and the more he actualizes himself. End of quote. Since the Great Divorce deals with beings that inhabit hell, one should further reflect on what Buber says about the demonic thou. That is, to the demonic thou, no one can become thou, no relations lead from him. He sees the beings as machines capable of various achievements which must be taken into account and utilized for the cause. This thou treats himself as an it. It has no subjectivity, but it has also no self-consciousness concerned with its being defined, with its defined being. End of quote. Demonic spirit is averse to meaning, says Buber. However, it is precisely meaning that keeps people alive and gives them a reason to live. Viktor Frankl stresses a key aspect of man's existence. There is a divine meaning in the life of the world, of man and human persons, of you and of me. He adds that ultimately man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life he can only respond by being responsible. Thus, logotherapy sees in responsibleness the very essence of human existence. This emphasis on responsibleness, that's the term used in translation, is reflected in the categorical imperative of logotherapy, which is live as if you were living already for a second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. End of quote. Last but not least, I-thou relation is reflected and fulfilled in the act of communicating. The Golden Rule relies on mutual relation and the language used to consolidate the relation between the agent, the one who does to others, and the receiver or the patient, the one who, by receiving, becomes aware of what he is expected to give. The speech act theory does not provide us in this respect with any more than the dialogic skeleton of highly diversified interpersonal exchanges, says Ricke, and every advance made in the direction of the selfhood of the speaker or the agent has its counterpart as a comparable advance in the otherness of the partner. End of quote, Ricke. Saying is doing, and the reference to John Austin's theory of speech adds a bit more insight to the impact of people's utterances upon the hearers. The I-thou relation gains, therefore, depth and insight. The utterance that is reflected in the sense of the statement is therefore straightaway a bipolar phenomenon. It implies simultaneously an I that speaks and a you to whom the former addresses itself. In short, utterances equals interlocution. End of quote. Finally, the perlocutionary acts refer to the effects of the utterances on the interlocutors and are probably the most significant with regard to behavior they adopt in response to such utterances. A closer look to the interactions in The Great Divorce will reveal the way all elements contribute to the I-thou relation may function or encounter glitches along the way. The opening throws the reader directly in the midst of an already disturbed relation. The setting is reflective of the mood. The mean streets, dismal moment, posters hung in rags, a grey town. The narrator attaches himself to the cue only to discover that the characters are paired in such a way that the I of the one struggles to communicate with the thou of the other. For the people in Hell, Lewis chooses words that refer both to their appearance as well as to their character. Waspish woman, beefy person, and a short man with a scowl. Their acts are qualified pertaining to the field of violence. The big man growled and fetched the short man one on the side of the face that sent him sprawling into the gutter. A female voice said with a whine that they were not going to make it to heaven. The entire atmosphere is indicative of a place that is populated with people whose company is most unpleasant. The arrival of the bus seemed to add a bit of hope, since the driver himself seemed full of light. His natural goodness is quickly judged as being unnatural, a sign that the people are obviously not prepared to approach the company of people different from them. Hale, in the description of the young tousled-haired youth, looks very similar to the present-day world. Although he detests the company of people waiting for the bus, he actually adds to the grim atmosphere by venting his frustration and criticism towards those who did not deem his work as worthy. What Lewis offers is probably the best description of a psychiatrist. He is able to find the reason beyond the young man's misfortune and unhappiness, a chain of broken I-thou relations, or meaningless I and it experiences that have led him to bitterness and a hopeless worldview. The language of people from hell, the people from hell use is mainly constative, verging on being judgmental. The elocutionary force of their utterings leads to reactions that are either emotional or leading to aggression in manifestation. Quarrels, fighting, menacing, this is the normal environment for the people from hell. Even when they get off the bus, there are curses, taunts, blows, a filth of vituperation as they struggle to get out. The readers find out that distance in hell is enlarged due to quarreling. Lewis is precise in rendering this distance in geospatial terms, highlighting the crude reality of a discontinued communication of an I-thou continuum. The distance is so vast that it leads to isolation. Since the I-thou relation is not bound by time, what strikes in The Great Divorce is that time and space are differently perceived. It takes centuries to get to the bus stop, and the spell of being in hell and meeting famous people is dissipated by the acknowledging of the extremely vast distances between the people. What is even more impressive in this relation that turns into an I-it paradigm is the people's character suffers an augmentation of the negative traits already acquired or practiced on Earth. Napoleon, the only character that seemingly is within reach, is agitated and distressed, blaming everybody but himself for his defeats. For him, everyone else was a useless it whose incapacity of making his own self pleased resulted in eternal misery. As the passengers approach heaven, light and color stun the eyes of the travelers. Delicious freshness came through the windows, says the narrator, but the short delighting into the approach of heaven is interrupted by the intrusion of one passenger whose manner of speaking is so familiar to that on earth. "What the hell are you doing?" shouted the intelligent man, leaning roughly across me and pulling the window sharply up. "Want us all to catch our death of cold?" Light came in the bus and revealed the faces of passengers, full of impossibilities. From Viktor Frankl's point of view, these are the people who will not find meaning because there is no openness to such a possibility. They were all fixed faces, distorted and faded. Then I caught sight of my own, says the narrator. This is probably the moment of the greatest introspection of the I in relation to the mobbing thou of those traveling on the bus. It is like an attestation of the self summoning up a trust in the power to say, in the power to do, in the power to recognize oneself as a character in the narrative. End of quote, Ricke. A crude realization strikes the reader when one of the passengers perceived as ghosts in heaven says that about his fellow travelers. They're not enjoying it. They'd be far happier at home. They don't even know what to do. This lack of purpose, so that was the end of quote, this lack of purpose and meaning is completely unexpected in a place that was supposed to abound in them. That is the heaven. The solid people that inhabit heaven are ageless. The one approaching the narrator made him want to dance. It was so jocund, so established in its youthfulness. What follows is a very good example of how hard it is to establish a now I-thou relation, especially when one of the interlocutors is an unforgiving, self-righteous man in one's own eyes, and the other is a repentant murderer ready to act for the benefit of the one who was not a murderer in the real sense of the word, but probably made more people miserable on earth. The exchange of replies between the big man, now perceived as the big ghost, and the solid spirit is very telling with regard to the force and the effect of statements. Well, I'm damned, said the ghost. I wouldn't have believed it. It's a fair knockout. It isn't right, Len, you know. What about poor Jack, huh? You look pretty pleased with yourself, but what I say, what about poor Jack? He's here, said the other. You will meet him soon if you stay. But you murdered him. Of course I did. It is all right now. All right, is it? All right for you, you mean, but what about the poor chap himself lying cold and dead? But he isn't. I have told you, you will meet him soon. He sent you his love. What I'd like to understand, said the ghost, is what you're here for, as pleased as punch, you, a bloody murderer, while I've been walking the streets down there and living in a place like a pigsty all these years. That is a little hard to understand at first, but it is all over now. You will be pleased about it presently. Till then, there is no need to bother about it. No need to bother about it? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? No, not as you mean. I do not look at myself. I have given up myself. I had to, you know, after the murder. That was what it did for me, and that was how everything began. In his blinded hatred and conceited self-righteousness, the big man has no chance of seeing the other as a totally new, redeemed self. He fails to grasp the truth that a repentant self can be restored to a new one that can be in heaven in relation to the eternal thou. He refuses outright the bleeding charity because he cannot grasp the fact that in it lies the whole mystery and miracle of bringing man back to a perfect relation with the creating eternal thou. This dialogue abounds in constatives, in statements that omit judgments and criticism. The questions do not have the expected effect in this I-thou confrontation because heaven is, as Lewis claims, a land of answers. The key is only to be finely tuned and ready to accept the unexpected answers as being the truth. The dialogue of one of the solid people and the ghost of a famous artist reveals the fact that in heaven the self becomes a person. The name mentioned by Martin Buber so rightfully designate the being in a true I-thou relation, as well as the reality that all men are equal and displaying the same traits when in heaven. When you've grown into a person, it's all right. We all had to do it. There'll be some things which you'll see better than anyone else. One of the things you'll want to do will be to tell us about them. In heaven, there are no longer distinguished people because the glory flows into everyone and back from everyone, the light, like light and mirrors. But the light's the thing. The artist then asked, perplexed and rather disappointed, do you mean that there are no famous men? To which the spirit replies, they're all famous. They're all known, remembered, recognized by the only mind that can give a perfect judgment. End of quote. Another very telling example of how an I can turn thou into an it to the point of exhaustion is in chapter 10 when the narrator faithfully renders an overheard conversation between a female ghost and one of the bright women. The female ghost refuses to remain in heaven if she were expected to meet her husband Robert. Her words echo the thoughts of many Christians. I forgive him as a Christian, but there are some things one cannot never forget. From her uninterrupted account, the reader finds out that this wife has turned her husband into a complete marionette, an object meant to meet all her needs and attain all her dreams. His self has been completely annihilated under the pressure of such a demanding I. Her speech testifies to the strategies that ruin the harmony within a marriage. I had to positively nag him, the laziness of man. I had married him. Well, I got him into the new house at last. I did my duty to the very end. I forced him to take exercise. How could I help if he did have a nervous breakdown in the end? My conscience is clear. I've done my duty by him, and what's worse, I add, if I'm given a free hand, I'll take charge of him again. He's not fit to be on his own. Put me in charge of him. He wants firm handling. There's lots of things I still want to do with him. She finally admits that it is so frightful in hell, that she's so miserable, and that she must have someone to do things to. The obsessive focus on the I in all her statements shows that there is no space for the other. And to bring to light her incapacity to see where she is wrong, her rhetorical question toward the end of her intervention echoes the bitter sarcasm of the author. Why should he have everything his own way? The meeting in chapter 11 brings light to what it takes to be able to love the other as oneself. You cannot love your fellow creature fully till you love God. The meeting between the lady and the tragedian in chapter 12 also points to the fact that in heaven people understand true love. I am in love. In love, do you understand? Yes, now I love truly. You mean, said the tragedian, you mean you did not love me truly in the old days? Only in a poor sort of way, she answered. I have asked you to forgive me. There was a little real love in it, but what we called the love down there was mostly the craving to be loved. In the main, I loved you for my own sake, because I needed you. As the book draws to an end, and to my speech, I will conclude with what the narrator highlights again as the requirement for the perfect dynamics between the self and the other. The loveless and the self-imprisoned should consent to be happy in their own terms, and only then would everyone else taste joy. The day must come when joy prevails and all the makers of misery are no longer able to infect it, or else forever and ever the makers of misery can destroy in others the happiness they reject for themselves. Thank you.
Joe Ricke from Rice University, USA, who is now an independent scholar and director of the Inkling Folk Fellowship, an international group of scholars, readers, seekers, and artists that are meeting every Friday. He was a professor of English and the director of the Center for the Study of C.S. Lewis and Friends at Taylor University, where he organized and directed the highly acclaimed Lewis and Friends Colloquium in 2016 and 2018. I'm sorry that I hadn't got there.
We talked about you there, though.
Okay. He has co-edited 3 books, and since 2012 has organized the Lewis and the Middle Ages panels, and this is very, very important. So
Yeah, if there's any medievalists here,
Yeah.
they should.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get people to come over from Europe.
yeah. So maybe you should tell a few
Maybe
words
some
about
money,
it.
yeah.
Yeah. So
All right.
thank you.
Thank you, Denise.
Tell us about the medieval festival.
Let's hear it for Denise one more time. It's like, wow, what a conference. And I'm going to waste my time, and I have a very long presentation, so I'll obviously then go over time. But no, I won't. Don't let me. But like, what a lovely day, and I'm just old enough to know that, I'm not going to have enough more of these, days like this. This city, this wind, the leaves out on the deck, all these people, and learning from the people of Eastern Europe, which is so significant to Inkling studies. Some of my mentors, not living, not that I knew them, but I read them in literature, were Eastern Europeans like Sven Todorov and especially Mochel-Caballero from Russia, and they were very important to my understanding of literature and my teaching of literature, and then I mentioned that 2018 at our big colloquium in the U.S., there were several people who've been here. And they were all talking about Denise and about Agora Christi and about the conference, and people should come. And I knew then that I'd be coming, and I was, of course, planning to come the next time you had one, but then COVID intervened. And so this is the first time. I have spoken twice for you, I think twice, maybe 3 times, on once at the conference and one on a special mini conference we did. So I'm from Texas, and everything in Texas is big and loud. I'm just big. No, and I always thank the Lord and also thank my parents whenever I get a. This is only the second largest audience I've had this week because we talked to 200 school children on Wednesday, and so that was quite a thrill at a really nice school here in town. I just want to start by saying, "Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by angel tongues above, flaming tongues above. Praise the mount, I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love." Normally I'd have a guitar and we'd be singing that, but probably not in this session. What? Tonight? Yeah, tonight. There's a coffee house tonight. You should come. I'll do a couple of songs. I think, if Andrew Lasso lets me, that's very questionable. You mentioned C.S. Lewis and the Middle Ages is sessions we run at the International Congress on Medieval Studies, which is in Kalamazoo, Michigan, at Western Michigan University. In the old days, pre-COVID, we had 3,000 medievalists there every year. It was unbelievable. Now, because of COVID, it hasn't returned to its old self, and probably won't because they're letting people come virtually. But this year we had a couple thousand, I think. Cheryl was there. We had amazing sessions on Lewis, and we had sessions on Shakespeare and things like that. So, almost every year we have two separate panels on C.S. Lewis and the Middle Ages, because it's a medieval conference. So our in is to say, we're going to do something about Lewis as a medievalist. He was a great medieval scholar. But also, it doesn't have to be a scholarship. It could be how his medievalism influenced his work in Narnia or the science fiction trilogy or things like that. So this coming year, we're having one on Lewis's depiction of women, and it's called Lewis and the Amazons, because he's particularly interested in Amazon warriors and that sort of thing, if you've ever read Allegory of Love, which I'll talk about today. And the heroine of that work is Britomart, who's a female knight. She dresses as a warrior and goes around beating all the men, but also Lewis and the Amazons, and he has other Amazon figures, but it's really about Lewis and women, especially strong women. And then Lewis and, Rethinking Planet Narnia. Rethinking Planet Narnia. We're hoping for some pushback on Planet Narnia. And I don't know if you know that work by Michael Ward, so that's going to be, we have 3 papers on Narnia, Rethinking Planet Narnia, and 3 papers on Lewis and the Amazons. My paper is on Enchantment and Disenchantment, and I'll just start. I originally hoped to write a paper that would analyze, criticize, and suggest alternatives to trends which collapse the distinctions between mystical experience, poetic inspiration, and scholarship. Initially very excited to hear, because I'm a big fan of Lewis's scholarship, and also I believe there's a real place in English studies for scholarship, and not just being fans and not just inspirational speeches. Initially very excited to hear that we would devote a conference to Lewis as an academic. I was then disappointed, sorry Denise, when I read that it would not really be on Lewis as an academic, but about re-enchanting the academy by following Lewis into the never land of scholarly enchantment. I'm only partly not serious. What if I was working on Lewis's scholarship, but not convinced that scholarship should be enchanted in the first place? How do I move my screen? Oh, this works. Scholarship should be enchanted in the first place or re-enchanted in the second, or is it the third? Or even not sure if scholarship, at least literary scholarship, is still scholarship or honest academic work when it is enchanted. As you will hear, Lewis had the same doubt. I believed and still do that disenchanting the subject, a difficult task requiring objectivity, detachment, and analysis, things we think are important for scholarship, is required of the scholarly vocation, and it is a vocation. It's a calling, as opposed to, say, poetry, which may not call for that detachment always, or paradisal visions of God, which may not call for that same level of attachment. Something Lewis obviously valued and demonstrated throughout his career. Lewis gives us specific examples, can you hear me okay, of the potential necessity of disenchantment. In The Funeral of a Great Myth, Lewis claims that the myth of popular evolution, which came to dominate Western thought from the late 19th century, is a kind of enchantment that is finally being broken, although such a tearing away from what we knew for so long can be a harsh and painful experience. Lewis comes to bury the great myth of the popular idea of evolution, but also to praise it for the deep hold it had on those under its spell. It's for the deep hold it had on those under its spell, because it, after all, was the work of the, this is quoting Lewis, quote, the work of the folk imagination, moved by its natural appetite for an impressive unity. It was a great story. And we're always talking about, it's the story, follow the story. Yeah, that was a great story. It had its earliest imaginative expressions in artists like John Keats and Richard Wagner, according to Lewis, and became ultimately, he calls it, a cosmic theory. The imaginative, enchanting myth went something like this. Not merely, this is Lewis, not merely terrestrial organisms, but everything is moving upwards and onwards. Reason has evolved out of instinct, virtue out of complexes, poetry out of erotic howls and grunts, civilization out of savagery. And conversely, reason, virtue, and civilization, as we now know them, are only the crude or embryonic beginnings of far better things, perhaps deity itself in the remote future. One thinks, obviously, Lewis was thinking of Dr. Weston in Out of the Silent Planet. That he's his model of this kind of thinking. It's one of the most moving, Lewis says, and satisfying world dramas which have ever been imagined. An enchanted story. After explaining why it cannot be true, because it rules out a credible knowing apparatus, in other words, although we do have images in our heads, the myth provides no sufficient reason to explain why we can have ideas corresponding to reality out there. Lewis admits, though, that it still has a powerful imaginative hold on humanity because, quote, it appeals to the same innocent and permanent needs in us which welcome Jack the Giant Killer. It gives us almost everything the imagination craves: irony, heroism, vastness, unity and multiplicity, a tragic close. I think he means the final mindless, humanless explosion or implosion of the universe. It appeals to every part of me except my reason. We must not, Lewis insists, fancy that we are securing the modern world from something grim and dry, something that starves the soul. The contrary is the truth. It is our painful duty to wake the world from enchantment. The real universe is probably, in many respects, less poetical, certainly less tidy and unified than they had supposed. Man's role in it is less heroic. It's only in the last resort, and after all lesser poetries have been renounced and imagination sternly subjected to intellect, that we shall be able to offer them, the people who held on to this wonderful story, any compensation for what we intend to take away for them. We sound like bullies, the people who want to take away this wonderful myth. Sounding as if the withdrawal from the drug of evolutionary thought will be a painful experience indeed. That's my commentary. For my own part, Lewis says, though I believe it no longer, I shall always enjoy it as I enjoy other myths. I shall keep my caveman where I keep Balder and Helen and the Argonauts, and there often revisit them. Pretty cool, pretty weird, pretty counterintuitive. No doubt the published conference theme here assumed that Lewis could be counted on to be on the side of enchantment, always, and against disenchantment, when it turns out, at least in this case, that the opposite may be true. But surely this is an exceptional case in the mind and or imagination of the author of things like Narnia and magical voyages to the Lone Islands and wonderful talking creatures and living pictures on the wall of a perfectly in need of enchantment Cambridge family in the Dawn Treader. To prove this, perhaps all we need to do would be to quote lines from The Weight of Glory, as Malcolm Guite did recently in a promotional piece for the conference on social media. Everything about the announcement and the call for papers proclaims that Lewis's, quote, prophetic, that is Malcolm, calling was to re-enchant the disenchanted, to cast a spell over, well, everything, including academic study. I won't quote it all now. Geit cited Lewis's cast a spell lines from Weight of Glory favorably, suggesting that this is the mission of Lewis followers in the present disenchanted age. To be fair to Malcolm, or at least to appear to be fair, which as far as rhetoric permits me, I must admit that Geit includes Lewis's acknowledgement that spells are made for breaking enchantments as well as inducing them. But he doesn't seem to realize what he just said as he goes on to pronounce, well, thank God for the caster of spells, this master of re-enchantment. Again, I remind us that Lewis figures his spell as a disenchantment, not a re-enchantment. I have need of the strongest spell. Don't worry, I'm going to get around to enchantment. We have to start from the facts, folks. I have need of the strongest spell to wake us from the, this is Lewis. I have need of the strongest spell, this is Weight of Glory, to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Which one is which? What's the obvious answer to the question? What's going on is yes, no, and I'm not sure what the imagination is the organ of meaning means anyway. Certainly we might feel we were back on solid and sacred ground when, in his lovely dedication to Preface to Paradise Lost, Lewis praises his friend, and in this case, this specific case, mentor, Charles Williams, for the experience of his lectures on Milton's Comus in the Divinity School of the Bodleian Library. And if you've been there, what could be more enchanting to think of these lectures going on in that spot, the Divinity School? You got to pay extra to get in there. As my brother would say in Texas, you pay extra for that. There we elders, Lewis says, there we elders heard what we had long despaired of hearing, a lecture on Comus, that's a work by Milton, which placed its importance where the poet placed it. Lewis goes on, this is, a dedication to a book is usually 3 lines, right? It's like a page and a half or 2 pages, the dedication of, it's a very special dedication to Charles Williams. Those of us who heard you in Oxford, many will understand henceforward that when the old poets made some virtue their theme, in this case it's the virtue of chastity, they were not teaching, but adoring. And that what we take for the didactic is often the enchanted. Williams, known for his enchanting and sometimes literally magical personality and actions, made the virtue of chastity his theme, blurring, like the ancients, the boundary between teaching and adoring. His lesson, his didacticism is an enchantment. But Lewis goes on, your short preface to Milton seems to me to be the recovery of a true critical tradition after more than 100 years of laborious understanding. The ease with which the thing is done would have seemed inconsistent with the weight that had to be lifted. Okay, we're getting to the disenchantment. As things are, I felt entitled to trust my own eyes. Apparently, the door of the prison was really unlocked all the time. But it was only you who thought of trying the handle. Now we can all come out. By the way, whatever we make of this stuff, such good writing, right? By Lewis, the prose, the rhetoric is so amazing. If I read this correctly, the world of Milton studies, lay under an evil spell, apparently cast by a century or so of devilish Milton critics. But Williams, who is figured as both enchanter and disenchanter, as Lewis sees himself back in that Weight of Glory passage, lifted the curse, which would be an evil enchantment, lifted the curse or the weight of the door of the prison. To be clear, and this will help us start understanding what it might be, that because I'm going to collapse the distinction and after a while say this is kind of all just verbiage in some ways, because enchantment and disenchantment, the way Lewis uses them, end up meaning the kind of same thing. If you're under the spell of a bad enchantment, we need a disenchantment. If the world is already disenchanted, we need an enchantment. But to be clear, this allegory of enchantment and disenchantment seems to be something like, and I think it's kind of a key to what Lewis does, Charles. You both explained beautifully and believed ardently what Milton thought. And believed that, what Milton thought, I'm sorry, you explained beautifully and believed ardently what Milton thought and believed. And that has made all the difference. This might be getting us somewhere in our quest for X. No, not Professor X. Oh, that was yesterday. Professor X, Paul Michelson. I mean the problem of solving for X. X being what enchanted scholarship might look like. Not only in Lewis's mind or imagination, if these are different, but in his practice. About a decade later, another not very attractive enchanter, I mentioned not very attractive because Williams, I think Lewis described as looking like a monkey. Another not very attractive enchanter, disenchanter, mentor, a marshwiggle by the name of Puddleglum, takes center stage in a great aegon with a powerful enchantress in the silver chair. She's known as the Lady of the Green Kirtle, also known as the Queen of the Underland, also known as the Witch Queen, also known as the Emerald Witch, also known as, she just turned into a big giant green snake. She tempts, persuades, and enchants, she is the enchanter here, the very recently disenchanted, finally just did that, which is a good thing, and now he's being enchanted again by her, Prince Rilian of Narnia, and his new friends, to give up their dream world mystification of a life, any life other than a life of bondage to her in the Underland. Literally, how they're supposed to do that is grow out of their wish-fulfilling fantasies about reality. She said, you just have these wish-fulfilling fantasies about reality, that there's really a thing called the sun, that there's really a world above this cavern under the ground. So, to exchange that for a reasonable view of reality, hers. This entire situation becomes not just a battle to escape enchantment or disenchantment, as the case may be, and I think we start seeing that we collapse these terms, and I give in. But a battle between enchantments and disenchantments, with some confusion as to which is which and who is whom. When I first wrote this, I was also thinking about something I won't talk about today except to mention it, because I hope it's going to come later. But the Hitler speech that Lewis listened to in 1940, right before, it was later that week, he goes to church and dreams up Screwtape Letters but he listens to the Hitler speech on the radio. His friend Dr. Havard was there, come to visit him, and they listened to Lewis said he was deeply, deeply moved. He was basically sort of enchanted by Hitler's voice and Hitler's certainty and that sort of thing. And he says, boy, if maybe I didn't have a friend there or something like that, I can feel myself just slipping, because he's basically saying in that talk, we're going to just bomb you to smithereens if you don't see things my way, if you don't. And he basically says a lot like the Green Lady. Of course, it's 12 years earlier. We need to be mindful, or at least what mindful used to mean before mindfulness was a thing, the thoughtful, wise, and prudent with our spells, our enchantments, and our disenchantments, and our discussion of same. In other words, or words from another context, we need to look along the beam and look at the beam and settle for no easy solutions when it comes to doing scholarship about enchantment, disenchantment, etc. Puddleglum, the faithful, sober, some would say, so wrong are they, unimaginative, Narnian marshwiggle, who is wise and worldly, who knows the mud and muck of the marsh, that too is the world, as well as he says to the Green Lady, the trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. And if you look back at this passage sometime, there's no commas there's no punctuation. It's just like all the world, like a Hopkins line, 9 words strung together with and, all that fullness. He knows this. I thought the talk yesterday on metaphor, which was so good, and I thought this functions kind of as a metaphor, just putting those ands in there in a way. It's just saying the world is so full. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. disenchants the witch's enchantment, which I think at this point we can say is not that important anymore. Which, we could say he's enchanting, but really he's not. With a spell that is not magic, or even a spell. Or if it is, the spell is the smell of his own burning hand. Mud filth, as she calls it, his mud-filled flesh. Allegorically, this functions in the story as a reminder of other stories or histories. By the way, story or history is the meaning of the Anglo-Saxon word spell. You'll hear people say God's spell, is the gospel, and that means God's spell. Spell, Anglo-Saxon, means story or history. So this functions his sacrificial suffering to break the spell. And functions allegorically in the story to remind us of other sacrifices. And in fact, a foreshadowing of just such a story within this story, and that is the harrowing scene of the piercing of Aslan's claw towards the end of the Silver Chair. Sorry for giving that away if you haven't read Silver Chair. But Aslan takes once again is hurt for us. Not only that, but the witch's long enchanting deconstruction of what Puddleglum thought, that's like what Coleridge thought, what Puddleglum thought functions too as an allegory of the kind of myth or spell of the great myth that we talked about in the funeral of a great myth, upon which Lewis pronounced a funeral speech, which was, after all, a scholarly myth, an ideological, very much like the witch's myth, ideological explanation of everything. Reminds me of some of the things you said yesterday, Alan, about the big mythic views of history that explain absolutely everything because they're a closed system. Ideological explanation, everything one would need to know if one were inclined to be a slave of the ideology in question. Which brings me to a tentative early stage conclusion of my search for X. X, remember, equals what enchanted scholarship might look like. Myth and story, imagination, spells, enchantments, disenchantments, beams looked along or looked at are not necessarily servants of the good, nor are they necessarily servants of the evil. There's got to be some other reference point beyond story, beyond myth, beyond the imagination. And I think Lewis is grounded in a kind of morality. They are potentially either. Whether an enchanted world, an enchanted story, and an enchanted academy is good depends on something higher than the magic, the enchantment, the imagination, the story, even higher than ents and elves and wizards. As we will see, Lewis sometimes denies that this higher element can or should be part of scholarship. He says, if I bring that in, that's religion. We shut Spencer and start talking just about God now, right? He does that, and I'll quote that later. But he then, through what my granny would call the back door, sneaks in echoes, hints, and longings for just that other thing, if it is a thing, that for Lewis, all other ideologies and formulations fall short of comprehending. I use that word carefully because it's from John chapter 1. Perhaps that other thing that stands above is what Levinas calls first philosophy, our ethical responsibility for the others we meet in face-to-face human encounters. Or perhaps it is Christ, who plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. That's Hopkins. As kingfishers catch fire, I highly recommend it to you. At this point, unless someone stops me, I decided I would start all over again, this time coming at this issue by reference to meditation in a tool shed. In recent years, a short article by C.S. Lewis, published originally in the local Coventry newspaper in July 1945, has gained substantial interpretive traction in Lewis Inkling studies. It is a short, apparently simple essay based on an apparently simple dichotomy about how we know and how we know what we know. Comparing and contrasting the competing claims of what Lewis calls looking at and looking along a beam of light. It's based on an essay by Alexander. I'm not going to go into all that right now. That's a footnote that if we get this published, there'll be a footnote in it. But his distinction between enjoyment and contemplation. Enjoyment is looking along. Contemplation is thinking about that in a more objective way, the way Alexander uses the term anyway. In fact, however, Lewis's discussion in that brief essay, as with all human discussion, and all, I mean, obviously we can argue about that, and all reflective thought, is always already looking at the beam, or looking along the beam. It's already, once we talk about it and once we start formulating it, it's already looking along, or looking at. That's inescapable. That's the ground of it. In love and numinous experience, in the intense joy, and that's part of apologia for scholarship. We're looking at. In love and numinous experience, in the intense joy or disgust of some primal experience, perhaps under hypnosis, perhaps an intense religious experience, whether Christian, pagan, or demonic, we may become part of what Mihai, see if I can say his name right, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, some of you maybe know him. He's, where's he from? He's not Romanian, is he? But what he calls the flow. Or perhaps, what? Csikszentmihalyi, yeah. That's what I said. No, I didn't. And do you know where he's from? I mean, I know he did this in the U.S., but he's Eastern European. Or perhaps at least something like what Owen Barfield calls participation. But like what I'm saying is in religious experience, in intense joy, disgust, sometimes in imaginative work, writing poems in the middle of a song or dance. But in reflection, why there's so much dancing, I think in anthroposophy, or at least among Barfield and Harwood, which I think was very cool. We had that great question at the school the other day, right, Denise, with a girl where we're talking about moments of joy, or we were talking about and she said, dancing, and she went through this whole thing. She actually wouldn't be quiet for a long time, but it was great, talking about the importance of dancing. But in reflection, so we have a dance tonight, right? At the coffee house.
I don't know.
But you're going to dance if we do a good song. But in reflection, communication, and especially for our purposes, scholarly work, we must, as Lewis does in the essay, without acknowledging it, I have that in italics, look at both our looking and our looking along or with the beam. This is not just a trick of language, it's the tether upon which human knowing, reflection, and communication depends. And if we believe in what I call a vocation of scholarship, that we don't cry about that. This is important. The trick is something that academic scholarship or conference the trick is the thinking that academic scholarship or conference can be enchanted if by enchanted we mean escaping the kind of mental work that, get ready to be bored, collects, organizes, summarizes, criticizes, qualifies, ranks, yes, even provides, Lewis hated this, footnotes, bibliographies, and accurate citations for the sources of our knowledge. You love it, right? It might be inspirational without that, but it probably wouldn't be scholarship. Perhaps, and it's a very significant perhaps, and certainly not a given, in something like poetry or painting, and I'm thinking of our absolutely amazing artists that were here this week. It's like, what a great contribution to this conference. Perhaps poetry and painting, such disenchanting mental work, because that's what I'm doing, that collecting, organizing, footnotes. It's disenchanting in one way, for sure, right? If we've got the magic of our paper going on, and we're in the flow, it's like, oh yeah, where was that source again? I guess I have to tell it, or the journal editor's not going to like that very much. Perhaps it's a very, but it probably wouldn't, such a disenchanting mental work. What John Keats disparagingly called, I love Keats, although I argue with him about this, disparagingly called consecutive reasoning. We would call it logical thinking. Consecutive reasoning. But perhaps in painting and poetry or some other things, that is temporarily suspended or nearly suspended. And I don't know if it is, but in terms of the myth of it, I know I embrace because it's so beautiful, the way Wordsworth describes it in Tintern Abbey, that almost suspended in his experience, it's an imaginative experience that for him is remembering a moment in nature. We are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things, right? So that's a certain experience. It's not scholarship, but for him, it's a kind of mystical experience that he then puts into his poem. But even once he puts it into his poem, he's thinking about how many beats are going to be in that line, and what's going to. No, it doesn't rhyme in Ternavy, but he's thinking about structural points. Thus allowing the participant to escape or see past such categorizations and secondary moves of the mind or soul, if scholarship can speak of the soul. Of course, even if that is possible, it's not clear that such imaginative, one more wrench to throw into this stuff here before we look at Lewis's scholarship. It's not clear that such imaginative, enchanted experiences are also always necessarily true or even healthy. The calling up of spirits in the Hebrew Bible, the Greek New Testament, in such literary works as C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, is not a good thing in and of itself. If you get the Eldilla and and the Oyarse to be with you, that's fine. But there's other spirits being called up in That Hideous Strength, for example. And here, to me, I think Lewis is always a moralist, and I know people disagree about this, and I think it's what Barfield objected to continually, especially in his long poem about Pegasus, or long dramatic poem. But it was such a great discussion between them, I think, throughout their lives, and I think iron sharpened iron, and they both benefited so much from their differences. The account in the Hebrew Scriptures of King Saul calling up what he hoped would be the spirit of Samuel, that didn't go so well, as you may know, the Witch of Endor in 1 Samuel 28. And it seems, I think, that Lewis transposed that into the larger spiritual and psychological chaos of That Hideous Strength. Ultimate contact may not be all it's cracked up to be. This was an ongoing point. I'll skip that now. I already mentioned it. But Lewis expressed concern throughout his lifetime for those who sought such experiences without proper tethering. And some of you know the story about the things that influenced Lewis very early in his life, the lunatic and the lunatic or Lord of all. No, that's not what I meant. That's the trilemma. But the different experiences with one, I think, was a parson, and one was a relative of Mrs. Moore or something like that. A couple of people that did that. At the simplest level, scholarship tries to understand the old-fashioned way by collecting, organizing, summarizing things I said. And its goal typically is not just understanding, but shared understanding. And experience, amazing experience that one may have, may not be communicated to someone else without this, what I call a secondary move, but I don't mean its secondary importance, these moves of the mind or soul or whatever. And its goal typically is not just understanding, but shared understanding, explaining, introducing others to the material, a key to Lewis's scholarship, as we'll see. He is drawing us in, enchanting us, or maybe disenchanting our worldliness, whichever it is, bringing us in because he wants us to share something. Thus, Lewis wrote to Barfield in March 33, "I'm a good deal worried by my inability to understand some of your article about Coleridge," which is so funny, I think, and which may be an admission that he has more work to do, he, Lewis, or that Barfield has more work to do, since it's his article that is in question. Well, enchantment and disenchantment, if I had time to talk about, which I will when I write it, by the way, I never present on something that I've been working on. At a conference, I always write something new for the conference, so I hope it's okay. Yeah, so enchantment and disenchantment, another way of looking at it is, of course, in an essay on bicycles. You guys know about that? The essay on bicycles by C.S. Lewis, where he talks about it. There's all these experiences in life that go from unenchantment, so he has 4 levels, from unenchantment to disenchantment to re-enchantment. This complicates the whole formula of everything, and I think in the end, they're all just interesting things to hold together. But I'm not going to go into. I don't think I'll go into explaining that. Maybe we can do it in a question and answer. Barfield in Long Pegasus dramatic poem I mentioned appears to satirize Lewis's hesitancy to keep looking along the beam, if you want to use that metaphor, or to give his soul completely to imaginative experience. If you don't know that poem, it's wonderful. Due to moral concerns. Lewis may, in his bicycle trope, see a more complicated movement than a two-pronged movement from unawareness, childlike, we don't know anything about bicycles, just bicycle we're looking at, there it is, to imaginative visionary splendor, riding down the street on the bicycle for the first time and having that power of speed and beauty, to dull, disenchanted duty, got to ride the bike to work every day. Lewis then applies it to marriage and a number of other things. To dull, disenchanted duty, to a mature, real enchantment, which realizes the inadequacy and even untruth of the latter, the disenchanted. It's inadequate and it's really untrue. But also the impossibility of sustaining the former, the moment of, splendor in the grass, Wordsworth would say. See Wordsworth at Tintern Abbey. Okay. We have gestured towards but not referenced to much of Lewis's own poetry and fiction, and I will not now. I have a little section here on it because I wanted to talk about how he looks at, it's kind of what we do at the medieval conference when we talk about his medievalism, how he uses the things that his work on the different scholarly things he's done and puts that into, rewrites Spenser in his fiction, rewrites these Bernard Silvestris especially, so important to him, I think. Well, we'll get to him now, maybe. So the first scholarly work I want to look at is Allegory of Love. What time do I quit? I should quit now? No, I'm saying, like, when I'm supposed to quit? I've got a thing here. Was it 1:20? No.
1:10, but we started later. So.
In his first published work of literary criticism and literary history, and I could just do an Allegory of Love. It's so great. Anybody read it? Yeah, when I was in grad school, they're still reading it. Amazing. A lot of Chaucerian, a lot of medievalists reject a lot of Allegory of Love and say Lewis made up courtly love. I mean, that it was in stories, but not in real life. And I know it was in real life in the World War II era because people who read Allegory of Love were living by it as a code. They thought, this is amazing. So it shows the power of Lewis and his visionary work. In his first great published work of literary criticism and literary history, The Allegory of Love, Lewis does what would seem to many at the time to be impossible. He makes long allegorical medieval poems seem exciting, thrilling, and even, dare we say it, sexy. This doesn't necessarily make it great or even good scholarship. Boy, it sure is interesting. But it certainly gained a hearing from an age not inclined to think such thoughts about long allegorical medieval poems. And it still should make us look and pay attention to the possible causes of such an unusual response. What did Lewis do to make that happen? And, we could then tag the term enchanted on that if we want. The original reviewer for the Sunday Times noted that Mr. Lewis has one of the most precious gifts with which a student of deceased literature, bracket here, my comment, I would love to hear Lewis's response to that descriptor of medieval poetry, deceased literature. He has the most precious gift with which a student of deceased literature can be endowed. He is never bored. Actually, sorry to be, again, disenchanting, those of us who know Lewis well know that he's not only bored, but sometimes disgusted with some kinds of literature, love song, proof rock. Although, T.S. Eliot, although much later, in an experiment of criticism, those of you who know that work, that these are the boundaries, in a way, of Lewis's literary criticism, right? He wrote a few short articles, but Allegory of Love, experiment of criticism, he makes a distinction more between good and bad readers, as opposed to good and bad texts, good and bad books, more central to his argument. Not as humble as me, I mean myself, Lewis would definitely have placed himself in the good, even ideal reader category. Be that as it may, The Allegory of Love was an overnight sensation. I'm writing the chapter on Allegory of Love in the new Routledge Companion to C.S. Lewis, so it's on my brain a lot, plus I love it anyway. Not the kind, because I love Spencer, not the kind of thing we expect for a scholarly book on medieval literature, especially not the kind of thing expected in the 1930s. Renowned Oxford and Cambridge scholar Helen Gardner, did you know Helen? No. Remembered her first experience of the book as if she had just discovered Harry Potter, or for some of us, Narnia. She went to bed with it. I still remember vividly a night in 1936 when, unable to go to theater because I had a cold, I went to bed with The Allegory of Love and read it without a pause into the small hours. I recognized and still recognize in this book a masterpiece of literary history, the work of a truly original mind. Whether one agreed or disagreed in detail or at large after reading this book, one's imaginative map of the past could never be the same again. I assume that Lewis might claim to be humbled by the loveliness of that last line, but I hope he might have said that he was proud. That one's imaginative map of the past could never be the same. What a claim for a work of scholarship. Because, as we shall see for Lewis, the imagination was required to do proper scholarship. Not proper necessarily by the dicta of our present age, but proper in the sense of paying proper attention to the literary work, imaginatively entering into it. No, but not only that. Then you're just solipsistic sitting there with your imagination. The idea is images concerns of those who've gone before us, and that's important to Lewis. I have a paper called Lewis's Debt to the Dead, and he feels a real debt to his great master, the great masters or mentors of him who are in the ground, and some pagan, some Christian. Lewis's early poems addressed to Milton, Sidney, Keats, and others, even from his teen years when he was studying with Kirkpatrick, testified to the powerful sense in which he felt and expressed his debt to his dead mentors. I gave this paper at Oxbridge last summer at the Academic Forum. The impact of Allegory of Love was felt deeply by sensitive young lovers in difficult and uncertain times of World War II. During the war years, one young Cambridge University student, she was a protege of Lewis's protege, Cambridge Renaissance scholar Muriel Bradbrook. A lot of people don't know she studied with Lewis after she finished Cambridge, she did a year to do work with him just when he was finishing Allegory of Love. Muriel Bradbrook, anyway, this young girl who studied with Muriel Bradbrook wrote a whole book full of love letters, now published. I found it in a bookstore sale a couple years ago in Austin, Texas, just going through the thing, and I opened it up, and there's all these references to C.S. Lewis. She wrote love letters to her fiancé, a Jewish British soldier, she was Jewish too, working in military intelligence. These letters are brilliant, breathless, emotionally charged, and often very funny. Her biographer writes, as she wrote those letters, Eileen was thinking of the portrayal of courtly love in her favorite book by C.S. Lewis, The Allegory of Love, which she described as the finest piece of medieval literary criticism of our times, and perhaps of all time, and of course this is a 22-year-old speaking. She seems to see herself half in the precarious dream world of medieval love poetry as the faithful damsel of troubadour tradition in her chastity belt, creating a romance as she writes to her beloved lord away on the crusades. She moves between the allegory of the body and the heart, and she follows C.S. Lewis in believing in the continuity of courtly love in the English into the English literature tradition of Shakespeare, Wyatt Dunn. She's a supreme writer of modern literary prose, and Lewis was her, she never met him, but her mentor in that, schooled by her love of English literature, etc. And I might add, schooled by Lewis and Bradbrook. The biographer goes on to suggest that her insistence on the virtues of chastity and faithfulness in her work, so at odds with her contemporaries, owes much to her Jewish upbringing. No doubt that is true, but perhaps he didn't know that the Allegory of Love well enough to realize that its featured Elizabethan writer was actually Edmund Spenser, and his monumental allegorical epic, The Faerie Queen. And Lewis concludes his book, famously, with an engaging reading of Book 3, the Book of Chastity, an in-depth account of its female hero, Britomart, the Knight of Chastity. Lewis is looking along Spenser and looking at Spenser. Lewis brings to life, this is looking along, I think, in reading when we apply that imaginative construct. He brings Spenser to life. He retells, he reframes, he stages Spenser for us, bringing the taste of immediacy and the Elizabethan Mongol aesthetic to play in our imaginations. And he, in turn, explains, compares with sources, praises, discovers, even here is a kind of story which we can be part of. And so that's the allegory of love. A couple of other things here. How else does he do something that maybe is a little out of the way? He favors out of favor little-known poets in Allegory of Love. Bernardus Silvestris, the 12th century Neoplatonist, or Platonist, actually, writer. The Italian Renaissance epic, Ariosto and Tasso. He rehabilitates long, magical, non-realistic narratives, romances, not that popular in the mid-30s under the spell of T.S. Eliot. Rehabilitating and reframing Spenser, as he does with Milton in 41 and 42, as he does with Hamlet in 42. He is a human speaking to his contemporaries about the way the deceased made sense of the world through literature. Do I have 2 minutes, or 10, or 7? 2? Okay, she goes 10 and this is 2. Okay, then, because I've got a lot of, I wanted to really get to angels in Paradise Lost, because especially the sex life of angels, which Lewis talks about, and it's super exciting, and it also, no, it's just super interesting, but also it leads to, I think, a big ending, which I'll get this when I get it written. Hopefully, maybe you might want to look at it, because his view of reading you can read that in Paradise Lost. I mean, I don't have to make anything up. You can just read it in Paradise Lost, chapter 14, preface to Paradise Lost, chapter 14, where Lewis talks about angels and their bodies, and their transsexuality, and their pan-somethingism. Panorganic. They're panorganic, and they're all feeling, and so for them it's just like there's nothing in the way. There's no, and he says that, and then it reminds me very much of what he does in experimental criticism when we expand our consciousness and we enter in. We in this room, if we share Lewis or if we share this thing, we're all part of one kind of thing that we can access. Not the same way angels do, but that we can access this amazing common life. Okay, I want to just give you an example of one of the greatest passages of Lewis's prose. It's a relatively long passage, but exactly 2 minutes.
Has already.
Oh, no, but I know, but okay. Well, it's pretty great, though. Okay, I'll stop, and then someone can say in the question time, could you ask that question? Could you read that passage, okay? Okay, I'll stop now. Thank you. Everybody, all the other speakers going to come up? Oh, okay, go ahead.
Could you read that passage?
Yeah, this is you know how Lewis wraps a book up sometimes, even his scholarly books, you get to the end and all of a sudden you're being taken to heaven? I mean, or something like it. He just gets carried away. I mean, we all know he's a rhetorical master, and that's why I've never trusted him. It's sort of like Thomas Merton, St. Augustine, C.S. Lewis. They're so good at rhetoric. I always think, okay, wait, what are you doing? What are you telling me? There's only 3 choices? Liar, lunatic, Lord of all? Aren't there 4? It's like you're so compelling, So this is not so much a poet writing about the some of this I don't even know what he means. It's just so great. This is not so much a poet writing about the fundamental, and I know Spenser well, about the fundamental forms of life as those forms themselves spontaneously displaying their activities to us through the imagination of a poet. The invocation of the muse to him hardly seems a convention to Spenser. We feel that his poetry has really tapped the sources not easily accessible to discursive thought. He's talking about this powerful imaginative experience, but he's looking at it. He makes imaginable inner realities so vast and simple that they ordinarily escape us. As the largely printed names of continents, a metaphor, escape us on the map, too big for our notice, too visible for sight. Milton has well selected wisdom as Spenser's peculiar excellence. Wisdom of that kind which rarely penetrates into literature because it exists most often in inarticulate people. It is this that has kept children and poets true to him for 3 centuries, while the intellectuals, on whom the office of criticism naturally devolves, have been baffled even to irritation by a spell. which they could not explain. To our own troubled and inquiring age, this wisdom will perhaps show its most welcome aspect in the complete integration, the harmony of Spencer's mind. His work is one, like a growing thing, a tree, like the world ash tree. It reaches up to the songs of angels or the vision of the New Jerusalem and admits among its shining ones the veiled image of God himself. It reaches down to the horror of fertile chaos beneath the Garden of Adonis and to the grotesque satyrs who protect Una or debauch Eleanor with equal truth to their nature. And between these two extremes comes all the multiplicity of life, transmuted but not falsified by the conventions of chivalrous romance. The great golden chain of concord has united the whole of the world. What he feels on one level, he feels on all. When the good and fair appear to him, the whole man responds. The satyrs gambol, the lances splinter, the shining ones rise up. There's a place for everything, and everything in its place. Nothing is repressed. Nothing is insubordinate. To read him is to grow in mental health. It goes on a little longer than that, but I'll stop there.